Welcome everybody to Junction Reads. It is sunny and very, very windy, but it feels kind of sort of like spring out there. I'm excited to have Silmy Abdullah here with us today to talk about her collection of short stories, Home of the Floating Lily, from DUNDURN Press. Silmy, welcome to Junction Reads.
Thank you so much. I had to remember to unmute myself.
I do that all the time too. Before we get started and we talk about what you're reading and we get to hear you read from Home of the Floating Lily, I'm going to share an acknowledgement of land from where I am, and anyone who's joining us here today, please feel free to share in the chat if you're joining us from outside of Toronto. Junction Reads exists in Tikaranto, which for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Wendat Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. I am specifically joining you from Adubakok, the place of the alders in Michisagi language. Both are still home to many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on their territory. Silmy, this is next to the reading. This is one of my favorite parts of our event, and that is asking the authors who join us what they're reading right now. It's an opportunity to steal ideas.
So right now I'm reading a novel by Elif Shafak. She's a Turkish-British novelist, and the book is called The Island of Missing Trees. It's her most recent novel, and I'm about halfway through. I haven't finished it yet, but essentially it's about a young couple who basically they're in love, and so one person is Greek and the other one is Turkish, and the novel takes place in the context of the conflict in Cyprus, where there's conflicts between the Greek population and the Turkish population, and how the conflict affects the relationship of this couple and their lives. And it's the most interesting part about this novel is that parts of it is narrated from the perspective of a fig tree, which I found was fascinating, right? So she explores the author, she explores the idea of trees being sentient beings and being able to observe and communicate with us, right? So I found that fascinating. And so this fig tree observes this couple's love and the troubles that they go through. And this fig tree is actually replanted in England, where the couple relocates, and the child of the couple, the young girl, she the fig tree is her only connection to her homeland, and she tries to find out about her past from her father, but she's not able to access that information. So I'm kind of in the middle of the novel, but I think so far it's been pretty interesting. So
that sounds amazing.
Yeah.
I love when nature plays a character, especially one with an emotional side. Is that it?
Yeah, that's what I'm reading right now. Actually, you know what? I mean, I try to. I get distracted very easily, so I read multiple things at the same time. But I'm really trying to, stop doing that, because I feel like I don't finish anything. So I have to admit, I've also started reading short stories by Haruki Murakami, and so his book First Person Singular. So I've read 2 stories. So those are the only 2 that I'm reading right now simultaneously. But I'm mostly focusing on the novel right now.
Yeah, so, I am so interested in that First Person Singular collection. I look forward to hearing you post about it and talk about it on social media. Before we hear you read, which I've been dreaming about for the last couple of weeks, would you mind if I share your biography with everybody?
Yes, of course. Okay.
Silmy Abdullah is an author of both fiction and nonfiction. She is a lawyer who practiced at the intersection of immigration, poverty, and gender-based violence. Most recently, she started her own consulting practice where she works with organizations on gender-based violence, anti-racism, and access to justice. Silmy was born in Bangladesh, spent her childhood in Saudi Arabia, and immigrated to Canada when she started high school. Home of the Floating Lily is her debut collection of short stories.
Thank you.
You. I look forward to hearing you read.
Okay. All right, so thank you everybody for joining today. I'm going to read from the second story in the collection. It's called The Secret Affair. The dreadful ringtone repeated itself. Abid Siddiqui looked up at the wall clock to confirm the time. Whenever his phone rang on a Sunday afternoon, he knew who it was without checking the caller ID. By now, he was well aware of Rina's schedule. She didn't work on Sundays, and late in the afternoon, when she had the house to herself for a few hours while her husband and children went shopping, she would call him to curse him, to remind him what a vile man he was. This routine began on the day she first learned about his marriage. Abid picked up the phone. Although he'd never bothered to resist the verbal abuse, he did at times try to divert the tirade by asking Rina about her job or the weather in New York. But today, different words came out of his mouth, words that surprised him. Listen, Rina, think whatever you wish, he said, but please don't call me anymore. Oh, so now you're running away? She hissed. Without replying, he hung up and placed the phone on the hall table, and when it rang again, he turned it off. Passing the suitcases that leaned against the wall of the hallway, he walked into the family room to give it a final sweep. The house looked much larger now that the furniture was gone. He pushed the broom against the floor and spotted an empty pill bottle lying in a corner. He bent down, took it in his hands, and sat down to catch his breath. It was Ruby's. In the final month of her life, his wife had been shifted to the family room. The chemo had made her too weak to get up the stairs to the bedroom, and the hallway on the second floor was too narrow for her to roll her wheelchair to the bathroom on the other end. From her new room, she could also access the kitchen easily, where she'd started to spend hours looking at the pantries and shelves she'd meticulously arranged over the years. Within days, the futon, the television, the speaker system, and all the Tug of War CDs that normally took up the space had been replaced by a single bed and an IV pole, turning the room that once echoed with laughter and music into a hospital ward. And then, in no time at all, the bed was gone too. Abid had disposed of it the day Ruby died on a snowy December morning, transforming the family room once more. Through it all, only one thing from that room had stayed, the pots of pink bougainvillea, Ruby's favorite flowers. They hadn't moved an inch from the foot of the window until it was time to take them to the back porch in spring. By the time winter came knocking again, they were back in the empty family room in the exact same spot as before. Even today, on the verge of shutting the doors of his home, Abid couldn't bring himself to get rid of them. This house, compact, old, and poorly maintained by the previous owners, had received its first makeover from Ruby. Our dream home, she'd excitedly declared the day they closed the deal. Sarah, their only daughter, was in high school at the time. Within a week of moving in, Ruby had painted the blotchy walls with warm beige and installed the white curtains in every room. The carpet in the second floor hallway was shampoo washed and embellished with Turkish rugs. Little by little, she'd marked the house with their family photos, hanging them on walls, pasting them on the fridge, placing them carefully on tabletops. The summer before she died, it was she who'd filled the back porch with the bougainvillea and instructed Abid just before frost hit that year to bring them into the family room so they could be revived the next season. For days, they'd argued about it. He'd wanted her to forget about them and let them die. Eventually, he'd relented and begrudgingly watered the shutting stems through the winter. Their house was on the periphery of Crescent Oak Village, a hub of Bengali immigrants, dense with towering high-rises. It stood on the corner of a street next to the busy Danforth and Victoria Park intersection. From every room, Abid could hear the grunting engines of cars and buses, wheels screeching before going silent in front of the red light, sirens crying out as fire trucks rushed to emergencies. The Bangladeshi convenience stores were minutes away, as were the corner eateries where immigrant professionals turned cab drivers and security guards gathered to talk about their broken dreams over milky tea and dal puri. At least we have a house of our own, Ruby would say whenever Abid complained about the neighborhood. So many of our friends are still struggling. It was her simplicity, her carefree nature that had made him fall in love with her. Because of her, his taxi drives at ungodly hours turned pleasurable, making him forget that he once worked day and night to achieve a master's in biochemistry from Dhaka University. In the evenings when he returned home, all his worries would dissipate, Every corner touched by Ruby's presence felt like a piece of paradise. Abid wished she'd never put so much effort into decorating the house, that she'd instead let it stay the way it was when they bought it. It would have been easier to see it transition into a hospital ward filled with medicine bottles and vomit. It would have hurt less if Ruby had ignored the leakage and dull paint on the walls, as one did in a cheap motel, rather than become a guest in her own home. And for this reason, there have been times when Abid felt a surge of appreciation for his new wife, Tamina, who had taken it upon herself to give the house another makeover, this time with bright accent walls, darker curtains, and new china. She'd also tended to the bougainvillea under his strict supervision, shifting them to the porch when the sun returned the heat and bringing them back to the family room in the winter. Now, Tamina was sitting at the entrance to the family room, lightly tapping on the open door. Abid quickly wiped his face, glad that his back was to her. Today was the one day he didn't want her to catch him crying. My calf should be here soon, she said. He stood up, holding the pill bottle, and faced her. She was wearing a pair of black slacks and a pale yellow shirt instead of one of the fancy bright colored blouses she normally wore. The gray streaks of the hair she usually covered with dye were prominent near the front of her head. What about your boxes? Yes, they're ready, she replied. He walked out into the hallway and observed his own boxes leaning against the wall. Tamina followed him. Abid, she said, there's no confusion. I've labeled mine. I won't take yours. Okay, thanks. It had been a while since he'd said sorry and thank you to her. In the early days of their 1 year long marriage, when he was extra careful about not hurting her, these two phrases were always at the tip of his tongue. On their first night together in his house, when she caught him stealing a glance at Ruby's photo on the bedside table while they undressed, he'd immediately walked over and shoved the frame inside the drawer. I'm so sorry, he'd said. He remembered how embarrassed he'd felt, wondering how he'd forgotten to put it away. He'd been meticulous about storing away all the other photos of Ruby. Before Tamina's arrival, he tucked them inside the various shelves in different rooms, refusing to put them in boxes and seal them with tape. Tamina had come into his life at a time when he'd lost the ability to anticipate or be surprised by anything. Ruby had been gone for 2 months, and the house still swarmed with friends who brought large quantities of both food and sympathy. They wondered aloud how he would spend his life alone, especially when Sarah had also left home, eloping with her Hindu boyfriend, Amit. At the same time, they would say with admiration that he loved Ruby too much to ever remarry. We know you won't be able to do it, Abid Bhai, they said to him as he sat quietly. You love her too much. You have too much respect for her memories to replace her. Ruby's sister, Reena, was the only one who'd never said anything on the subject. For Reena, Abid's eternal loyalty to her sister was the most sacred truth of her life. She didn't need to proclaim it. At night, once the guests left, Abid would lie down in his bed, staring at the ceiling for hours. He would wonder what to do with the stillness and the storm that had struck his life. He'd become desperate to escape the haunting silence of his home and equally the ringing voices of his friends. All it had taken was a single phone call from his mother on an icy February morning. Enough is enough, she had said. I want to see you immediately. Within the next 2 days, he'd packed his bags and flown to Dhaka. A week into his visit, his mother told him that she would never forgive him if she died without seeing a wife by his side. Thank you.
That is such a great story. It's so heartbreaking. And you have this knack in every single one of these stories for creating this escalating tension that is it's almost promised that it's not going to end in conflict, but it's going to end in something heart opening or heartbreaking. I can't put my finger on it because each one of them is so different. The Secret Affair and a couple of other stories touch on love and marriage, specifically the idea that love is forever. Mm-hmm. Love is undying, even in the wake of death, as in Abid and Rubina's marriage. Mm-hmm. And Tamina, oh my gosh, my heart just broke for her at the end of the story. Can you talk to me about how important it was for you to develop the marriage and the love stories in equal measure with all these stories?
Yeah, I mean, I think this collection, each story in this collection is primarily about, I mean, it talks about a very specific community and the very specific context of the migrant experience, but at the core of them, they're all really about our universal human emotions of love, right? And the very universal experience of family and relationships. So that was sort of the common thread that I wanted to have throughout the collection. So, and I've always been very curious about, understanding what people feel in these, or what people experience in these times of familial conflict or death. What happens to love when a spouse dies? Is it possible to love again, right? Like, especially this aspect of relationships. Can you love again, or can you forget the person that you had loved for such a long time? So that curiosity drew me to write this particular story. But it was very, to answer your question, that's what I wanted to focus on, right? So for me, it was important, very important to develop that arc in the character, right? To see how, to build that I guess, the story of how the relationship developed, or how the relationship was, and what happens to the relationship once either an external event happens or an internal shift happens, right? So yeah.
And Tamina too is i- if not in love with him, acts with such incredible love
Mhm.
by I guess allowing him to be alone,
Right.
by doing what she does. I won't spoil it because you didn't share the entire story. So
Right.
um, again, that relationship between Tamina and Sarah in what she does for Abid at the end, and all of the female relationships in Home of the Floating Lily, mothers, sisters, sister-in-law, sisters-in-law, they are all so. And I'm thinking of Amina, the auntie's helper, and
Right.
can't remember the name of the character in that story. Sorry,
Rima.
that
Rima.
Rima,
Yeah.
that kind intense love, right, and friendship and respect, and every positive adjective you can use to describe female relationships. Can you talk about that? And because every single one of the story, I feel
Mhm.
every single one of the stories
Mhm.
has a powerful kind of female to female love story, if
Right.
you'll allow that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. On, on a very apparent surface level, you'll see that most of the stories are written from the perspective of female characters as well, right? So most of the protagonists, if you will, are female, except with the exception of the second story, A Secret Affair, which is written from the perspective of a man. But even in that story, there is an exploration of female relationships,
Mhm.
right? So um, I really wanted to highlight that sense of sisterhood, or the solidarity that takes place between females by virtue of common experiences based on gender, right? So do they share the same struggles? Do they share the same pain? Do they share the same joys, right? So you'll see in the stories that there's a lot of love between females, but female relationships are also a site of conflict, right?
Mhm.
So for example, in the story, All the Adjustments, there's competition, there's jealousy, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's also love and respect. So I was very curious to explore all the nuances and complexities of female relationships. So
Mhm.
that was sort of what I kept common throughout.
Yeah, you mentioned All the Adjustments. There's a line in All the Adjustments, Rachel, who has a Bengali dad and a
Hmm.
British mom, and she talks
Hmm.
about her name being Rachel Khan and having this cultural tug of war.
Right.
And she ends up in Dhaka, where she has, as you mentioned, the conflict with her sister-in-law. And
Hmm.
that cultural tug of war lives in a number of these stories as well, with Sarah and her
Right.
Hindu boyfriend. And
Right.
so how was that? I think about that in the context of writing these very time and place stories, right? You mentioned Crescent Park, and
Mhm,
the majority of the, or all of the characters outside of
mhm,
the outsiders are Bengali.
mhm.
How was that? How did you approach having um, building those relationships into your stories?
Yeah. So in terms of the geographical space, that was actually a decision that I made at the very end, when I was very close to publishing the book. I thought it might be interesting to actually tie all those characters to a specific geographic space, so that it seems like you're getting a window or a glimpse into
Mhm.
different the lives of different families, perhaps in a building or in a neighborhood, right? So it kind of, it's not a novel, but it feels like it's all part of the same community, right? So that's what I went for, but it was a decision that I made near the end.
Yeah,
In terms of the
interesting.
cultural tug of war that you talk about, or that I mentioned in that story, um, that's essentially what the immigrant experience is, right? So anybody who leaves behind, and not just in the context of migration, I feel like all of us, if we have a sense of home with one place, and that sense of home shifts, if we leave behind one home to move to another home, then we feel this conflict of that, the constant non-belonging, right? And at the same time belonging, feeling like we belong to multiple spaces or multiple places, right? Or having multiple identities. At least that's how I felt, having grown up in different parts of the world.
Yeah.
That's a complexity and a richness that I get to experience all the time, right? And that's what most or all migrants, or anybody who's left a sense of home, one sense of home to get to another, they face that. And so the character of Rachel in particular, it was inspired. She was inspired by families that I've observed where a person, let's say from Bangladesh, has come to Canada and meets somebody who's not from the same culture or community, and then
Hmm.
they go back and live. The person who's outside of the community goes back and lives there and tries to adjust to that community. I've seen that happen quite often, but I thought it would
Hmm.
be more interesting to explore somebody who's mixed race, right? If you want to call it that, how
Right.
does that complicate it even further? So so that tug of war that she feels as someone who belongs to, who has parents from two different ethnicities,
Yeah.
what sorts of complexities do that person face? So
Mhm.
um
And
yeah.
and the conflict in that too is she's welcomed, right? She's
Right.
welcomed with so much love and so much um, friendship. And it's almost her internal conflict where
Right.
she's feeling constantly displaced, like throughout
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
her welcoming.
Yes, and even in that sense of welcoming, even though it was very, there's no malice in there. People are actually trying to make sure that she adjusts and she doesn't feel discomfort and all that. But she feels that she's being infantilized. She feels that she's being
Right.
patronized, and so you're right. It's about her internal conflict.
Yeah. And that she'll never be enough.
Right.
Was yeah. If anyone, I just have a couple of more questions, but if anyone has any questions for Silmy, please feel free to put it into the chat, and Kaylee will ask on your behalf. I was interested in gossip. That the very first story, what it blew me away,
Thank
honestly,
you.
with the idea that gossip is in fact its own character, not just in this story, but a real nemesis kind of that
Mhm,
the women primarily are
mhm,
facing every day, with whether or not they're Abid's case, of course, he's facing Rena, and
mhm,
in the other stories, it's the secret affair between um, Asif and Aliyah,
mhm,
and all of
mhm,
these things that are happening that a lot of the characters in the stories don't know is happening. How, and yet, again, on top of that, facing gossip as a nemesis, they still come out victorious. And I'm interested in your perspective on that, and how challenging it was to not create a kind of withering character who shrinks in the presence of this terrible
Right.
gossip.
Right. So my primary goal, or my ultimate goal, I should say, with all these stories was to not create stereotypical characters, or to kind of perpetuate that idea that, oh, women from a particular community are weak, or they don't have any agency. So I really made sure that that didn't come through, or that's
Yeah.
not the message that was coming out. But at the same time, I didn't kind of want to make it so black and white, where they're coming out where they don't care about the gossip at all, right? Or they're completely succumbing to it, right? So
Right.
I didn't want to make
Yeah.
it that dichotomous. So you'll see that in the first story, the community gossip, where people are kind of talking about this divorced woman and all of that, it really impacts the main character, Shumi, right? It's
Mhm.
not like it doesn't have any consequences in her life. It actually does drive her to make a decision in the end, which might seem like, okay, she's kind of given in,
Yeah.
but at the same time, she is, without giving the ending away, at the same time, she doesn't surrender completely, and that shows up in the way her relationship takes a turn with her husband, right?
Mhm.
So even with Rubina, the woman who's the subject of this gossip, who's being stigmatized for being a divorcee, she's still in the community, and she's still
Yeah.
serving people with her catering business. It's not like she's run away, right? But at the same time, she feels the tremendous pressure of getting her daughter married, because she feels like nobody's going to marry her daughter, because
Want her.
she's the
Yeah.
daughter. Yeah, she's a single mom, right? So there's both sides there. It is complicated, right? And I wanted to show gossip as an aspect of community, right? Where you have a real sense of community. It has two sides to it, where people feel that they have this entitlement to, even if they don't know you that well, where there may be people that feel entitled to talk about you, or to pass judgment about you, and make
Mhm.
have an opinion about your life. And at the same time, the other side of it is that this community will come and support you in the hardest of times. For example, in Abid's case, when his wife dies, the community comes forward with food. It's almost like they don't even need permission, right? Like they're
Yeah.
coming, they're swarming his house with food and all of that. But at the same time, they're making all these assumptions that, oh yeah, you're never going to get married again. We know that, right? So it's the different shades of community. What are the good sides of it? What are the bad sides of it? So
Yeah.
yeah.
And gossip wasn't necessarily that, envious,
Mhm.
mean-spirited character.
Exactly.
There were moments when you overheard people talking in a very
Mhm.
caring and loving
Right.
way. So
Right.
it had dimension for sure.
Right. And in the second story, Abid, I would say Abid and Tamina, they were truly victorious in
Mhm.
kind of not, even though they have their moments, and they do make decisions where you feel like they're surrendering to the gossip, but at the end, they completely,
Yeah,
veer
exactly.
away. So yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Um, you talked about earlier living in different parts of the world, and I wanted to connect that, or I was hoping that you would connect that to the feeling of belonging that exists in the
Mhm.
novel, and how,
Right.
having spent big chunks of your life, and not just traveling from one place to
Mhm.
another in quick transitions, you spent
Right.
formative chunks of your life in three very different parts of the world.
Right.
How do you think that played into your creating these characters and belonging to
Yeah.
a place or a community?
Yeah, I would say it had everything to do with it, right?
Yeah.
Because as someone who has lived this hyphenated existence, right,
Mhm.
where I was born in one country, I moved at the age of one. moved to a different part of the world, but at the same time was connected to my birth country, because every year my family would take me back to make sure that we were connected to our heritage and our language and our grandparents and extended family. So this constant shuttling back and forth was it's what I knew from since I was a baby, right? And then at the age of 14, I moved to Canada. And so that added another layer to this type of, I guess, multiple identity. So I've always felt this sense of not being settled, right? And feeling at the same time that I belong in multiple places and I belong nowhere at all, right? So, and hence the title Home of the Floating Lily, right? Because we're rooted underneath the water, but then essentially we're floating, right? So yeah, that's that. And so that really I guess dictated how I created my characters, because that sense of loneliness, that sense of not being settled, that sense of that perpetual journey of trying to find a sense of stability and a sense of home, that is essentially the core of every single story. And that's what every single character is going through, even whether they're the main character or, you know, a peripheral character. They're all going through the same journey in different ways, right? So so my own lived experience has had everything to do with it.
Yes. I love the, I'm not sure where I read it, but just saying that in describing a lily pad flower, I guess, in being seen above the water, but actually being or existing somewhere else. I thought that was beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah. I will pause. And Kaylee, do we have questions? We do have questions.
Yes, we have a question from Diane, and Diane says, I was really engaged by the insight into the perspective of Bengali women. And what are you thinking about or working on now?
Hi, Diane. It's nice to see you. So yeah, I'm actually now working or trying to work on a novel. So it's a completely new venture, and I feel like I have to learn this craft because I've been working on short stories for so long. And I've spent so much time trying to learn the craft of writing short stories. I feel like now I'm starting from scratch, right? So I guess the only thing I'm able to share at this point, because my ideas are all over the place, is that it again will focus on the Bangladeshi community, but this time it will be a fuller length, of course, like one story stretched out over a longer period of time. And but at the same time, I'm also working on short stories, because short stories, you know, work in a very strange way. Like this idea comes to you and you feel like, okay, I need to write this down now, right? And you just, I don't know, I guess it's something that you use your judgment to know whether this would work more in a short story or a novel. So when these little ideas come to me, I write them down. So I've had a short story just published in the Puritan magazine earlier last week, and working on another one right now. So yeah, that's been keeping me busy in addition to my day job.
Right. Yeah. Your tiny little day job. So, I noticed, because Home of the Floating Lily, for anyone who hasn't picked up the collection, Home of the Floating Lily, the title story is quite long. And there are a couple of stories that are very short, but you're not a short story writer. So I feel like or I'm hopeful the transition to novel writing will be easier.
I hope
than
so.
it would be if you were a natural short story writer.
Right.
Yeah. Home of the Floating Lily, I thought when I finished it, I thought, man, that could be a novel.
Right.
That especially because of all of the perspectives that potentially be seen, I guess.
Yeah. I actually had started it as a much shorter story, and it was written completely from the perspective of the mother, Shanaz. And then I thought, yeah, it's not really working. So I didn't want to, because there's so much in there. It felt crammed and it felt rushed. So I thought it would be interesting to explore the two perspectives of the mother and the daughter. So I thought, why not stretch it to sort of like a novella length?
Yes.
Right. So
yeah. And Tasneem's perspective is so powerful. I mean, the moment when she discovers what she discovers is like oh my gosh, I can't even imagine finding that out. But just, everything in the past being included into the story, I thought could easily be very long. Yeah. In a good way. Kaylee, any more questions?
Yeah, our next question is from Claire, and Claire asks or says, I'm always so intrigued to hear about how writers' day jobs affect their work and their writing. How do you think your work in law and in social services impacts your writing and your stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually get asked this question at every event. And every time I get very excited to answer this, because I think, every writer, at least in the beginning, has another job, right? Because we cannot sustain ourselves with writing, at least when we're starting out. So I wouldn't say it has its blessings, but at the same time, it's extremely challenging, because the blessings are that I don't have to worry about putting food on my table, right? So I have this stability that allows me to write and create without that stress of where's my money going to come from. But the challenge is finding the time, right? So especially when I was a litigation lawyer, it was extremely tough. Even if I had pockets of time, I didn't have I wasn't in the headspace, or I didn't have the energy to have that creative I guess outlet, or be in that space to be able to create, right? And so the initial drafts of these stories were written when I was unemployed. I was actually fresh out of law school, and I was looking for work. And during that transition time, I had written the first drafts of these stories, and they were terrible. But once I started working full time, I found breaks and pockets where I would have to completely shut out that other side, or that other aspect of my work. Just because of the types of cases that I was dealing with. They were extremely heavy, a lot of domestic violence cases, a lot of newcomer women. So it was just very, very heavy stuff. So people on the verge of being deported from Canada. So it's just absolutely, emotionally extremely heavy. So it was very difficult, but I have to really shut out that part to be able to create. And so, I did most of my edits while I was working. So I had to take sometimes I had to take three-week breaks. At one point, I took a 1-year leave, to finish the edits. So that's how I did it, I guess. And part of the reason why I made the switch to consulting is because I wanted to be self-employed. I wanted to have more flexibility with respect to my time, with respect to my writing. So, but the other good side of it is that, to answer your question about how my work impacted my writing, is the stories, right? The many people that you meet, the many stories that you get to hear. Even though I wrote most of these stories before I met many of my clients, and none of the stories are directly taken from my clients' stories. They're not, but when you kind of use the same muscle when you're practicing law and when you're writing, because you have to have compassion, you have to have that sharp sense of observation and understanding of human emotions and experiences. So that's how I guess it impacts my writing.
Yeah, I can't imagine how challenging it would be to kind of disengage from cases like that when they are, as you say, so emotional and deep.
Right.
Kate, and I'm glad that it worked out in our favor.
Thank you.
To be honest. But Kaylee, are there any more questions?
Yeah, we have one last question from Diane, and you kind of touched on this in your last question as well. But Diane asks, what is your writing process or structure? And then also adds, especially with your day job, how does that work for you?
Right. So when I had my litigation when I used to practice as a litigation lawyer, I had no structure, to be honest. I didn't write for long stretches of time just because I couldn't find the time or energy to do it. During that time that I was looking for work, it was the most luxurious time of my life in one sense, because I could spend 7 to 8 hours a day just reading works of other authors, writing, and really, developing my craft. But normally, whenever I have the energy, I like to write very early in the morning when everybody is asleep. It's completely quiet, and I feel like that's when my best work happens. So normally 6 to 9, provided that I go to bed early enough the previous day to be able to wake up and do the work. So those 2-3 hours is my best time, and then all my worldly duties start coming up, and that's it.
Right.
So yeah,
and it ends. Yeah.
yeah.
I'm always so envious of writers who can do that early morning block. Even if I get up early, I feel like I spend the first hour and a half with, coffee and talking to myself and trying to engage with.
But that's important, I think.
Yeah.
You have to have a morning ritual, I feel like. So I do the whole coffee, and sometimes you do a short meditation, and you just have to kind of like prime yourself to be able to sit down and write, because otherwise you're just going to be groggy, right? So,
Yes, exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
No, that's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us and for talking to us about Home of the Floating Lily. I'm excited. This is also a good part of Junction Reads. We get to give away 2 copies of your book, given to us by DUNDURN Press. You've got a great chance of winning it today. Kaylee, I'll hand it over to you.
Right, the like add spotlight and mute. I wish that was like one button, because it's like they're in opposite corners, and every time I'm like frantic. Alrighty, yeah, I'll start our draw. All right, so our first winner for today is Tamina Khan. Tamina Khan, I think, is here.
Is she here?
Yes, I assume that Khan T is, the T is for Tamina.
Oh, right, yeah, there she is.
All right, oh, wrong way. All right, and our second winner is Kevin Wilson.
Yay, Kevin.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much. For the winners, I have both of your email addresses, Tamina and Kevin. So you can email me, or I'll email you with your mailing address. Or if you've read the book and you'd like to give it to somebody else, you can send me the name and mailing address of whom you'd like to gift the copy of Home of the Floating Lily to.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. We're off for the next 2 weeks, back here on March 27th with Robert Huff and his novel, The Rose.
Marriage of Rose Camilleri.
Marriage of Rose Camilleri. Thank you, Kaylee. That's what happens when you close the Word document before everything's done. Thank you again, Silmy, so much. Congratulations on this novel. It is spectacular, and I look forward to reading the novel when it comes out.
Thank you.
I hope we can talk about it then. Thanks,
sure.
everybody, for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.
Kaylee. Thanks. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.